Good afternoon and good morning to all of those who are joining us. Today we are going to look at self-evaluation, an introspective look at project progress. I am the facilitator for the presentation today. My name is Rondell Clay. I'm the Regional Director for the Eastern Region Training and Technical Assistance Center. We are a resource for the Administration for Native Americans. I'd like to introduce to you Theresa Peterson, who just recently joined the Lower Sioux Indian community as the tribal planner and grant writer near Morton, Minnesota. Prior to that, she worked as a community research and planning consultant for Dakota Wichohan, a Native nonprofit whose work is in the Dakota language and lifeways revitalization. Previously, she served as the executive director for Dakota Wichohan and is one of the original founders of the organization. As a former vice chairwoman of the Upper Sioux community between the years 2003 and 2007, she was commissioned in tribal transportation, housing, language, and education. Theresa is a past tribal government official, awardee of the Minnesota Indian Education Association. She also has worked in Indian education, social and mental health services areas. She earned a Dakota language apprenticeship in 2001, where she was able to study and record Dakota language from her grandmother and her father-in-law. She earned her doctorate in education with a major in teaching and learning and an emphasis in Indigenous education at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. She was selected as a Holmes Scholar through the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education and a Shakopee Sioux Community Endowment Scholar. Her research was on a cultural intervention's influence on American Indian students' sense of belonging. She also has earned an MS in Educational Leadership from Southwest Minnesota State University and was an Ethel Curry Scholar. She earned her BA in Human Services from the University of Minnesota at Morris. Theresa serves as an advisor to the development of the Indigenous Youth Research Center through the Native Youth Alliance of Minnesota. Theresa is a 2011 Bush Leadership Fellow. She is an Americans for Indian Opportunity Ambassador alumnus and currently serves on the AIO board, whose mission is to support strong Indian leadership and encourage participants to weave their traditional tribal values into a contemporary reality. She is a Blandin Indian Reservation Leadership alumnus and currently serves on their Indian Advisory Board. But most importantly, Theresa is a wife and a mother of 3 sons and enjoys traditional and heirloom gardening and preserving. And I can tell you from personal experience, she has shared some of her dried corn with me, and it was just wonderful. Let me give a brief overview for our webinar today before I turn this over to Theresa. Funding for projects in Native communities is very competitive. Most funders require that projects provide accountability measures that will prove that the project was implemented per the approved project application and that the project was accomplished the goals set forth. ANA is no different in this respect. In order for them to get money appropriated by Congress, they have to prove to Congress that the money ANA gave out has made positive impacts in the funded Native communities. Therefore, ANA grantees are required to evaluate their projects and report back to ANA. Just as a side note, it's also required that they do this reporting to Congress as part of their legislation. As most of you know, there is a whole section in the application narrative that talks about outcomes and impacts of the project. The OWP asks you to talk about the results and benefits of the project. However, ANA doesn't expect us to use credentialed evaluators to gather and report on the data. In fact, ANA prefers that grantees come up with their own methods for evaluating their projects. That is a daunting task for some. Today we are going to talk about one organization's journey in developing their own language assessment. As you may know, ANA requires all projects that teach their native language to assess fluency as a means of measuring impact of the project. They do not tell you how to assess fluency, just that you have to do it. All grants expect grantees to measure the successfulness of their project or program in some way. The process our presenter went through to develop their assessment can be adjusted to fit any type of project. And with that explanation, I want you to think about the 5 points that you see on the screen. Knowing how well a process, method, or technique is working helps the grantee to determine changes that are needed, if any, to be successful. Evaluation is an ongoing process that is not only pertinent to the project completion, but also to the functioning of the overall organization. It is very difficult to improve if you are not assessing what you are doing and how successful it is. It is important to take the 5 issues addressed on the screen and incorporate those into your project planning process. Doing so ensures that you provide the time and resources to evaluate during the project period. So, let me turn our presentation over to the expert. Terry, it's all yours.
Pidamaya Rondell. What I'm going to share today is, isn't just something that I thought of. This is something that a lot of people have contributed to, and a lot of influence from organizations and Indian leaders throughout. And I especially want to recognize Dakota Wichocha, of which we're highlighting their evaluation process today. So some of the initial steps to kind of think about it when developing your own community culturally appropriate evaluation process, including its instruments, is to really think about your cultural values and your knowledge systems in the community you serve. So some things to think about are our knowledge systems, our ways of knowing, our values, and we want to work from that community worldview and not someone else's. Our evaluation methodologies should align with those concepts. There are times, of course, where we run into organizations and funding partners that have a different framework they are working from, and it's tricky to mitigate this. I was happy to hear Rondell say that ANA doesn't tell you how to do it, just that you need to do it. So our ways of knowing, our knowledge base, and our values sometimes aren't necessarily in alignment with others, so it's good to get clear about what yours are. Other cultures might view different things more important than indigenous communities. And just as a broad example, a capitalist-based culture often focuses on money or return on investment as the evaluative process or measuring stick. But I think today we'll be able to demonstrate how we can work towards utilizing our own knowledge, our own cultural ways of knowing, values, and align our evaluative methods accordingly. So to begin, we want to think a little bit about our framework, and some of this is a little bit utilizing some academic jargon, but I'll use both. So often Indigenous frameworks include our knowledge, our ontology, or our ways of knowing, our epistemology. And one of the ways I like to think about our epistemology, one of those ways of knowing is like our elders' ways of knowing. And for Dakota people, this framework is really based on relational or relationality. We often use that phrase, mitakuye owasi, that all my relatives, everything is related. And so, and then the idea that there's more than one right answer, that there's multiple realities. And sometimes from non-Indigenous communities, that kind of operates from that one right answer. So, and in terms of what we value, or our axiology, we want to think about that as well as part of our framework. What is it that is of value? And then, of course, all of this ties into what evaluative method you're going to use. And for us as Dakota people, that methodology is really tied to accountability back to the people, to our relatives, to our community. All of that's factored in because, of course, we're not separate. We work with our relatives. So when considering participant-oriented evaluation, and what we mean by that is that as opposed to utilizing an external evaluator that has sometimes little knowledge of those ways of knowing and our value systems, we really might think about utilizing our own participants or constituency or stakeholders to really help and assist in what is it that we're going to evaluate. So this model mirrors our traditional forms of decision making in that all voices matter, including your participants in developing evaluation tools or processes or even how data gets collected. At least hearing from them what they like, what they didn't like, and shape your evaluation from this is participant-oriented evaluation. Using this provides an opportunity for all voices to be heard and to participate. It's planful and deliberate in that it helps you frame what you're trying to evaluate in a culturally appropriate context. This process then also supports community transparency.
Before you go on, Theresa, how could you apply this to, say, a project that was going to help a community start a youth program?
Well, of course, including youth in helping define what those goals are, defining what those outcomes are, and even asking them, when you've done data collection in the past, surveys or whatever other methods you're using, asking them what did they like, what did they not like. But I think as we continue, it'll become more apparent how you can use this with any sector in your community.
Thank you.
So when we work to develop our own internal capacity to evaluate, and that's, again, like what I'm sharing today, what we did at Dakota Wichoka, is everything from designing what gets measured, how it's collected, all of that. We decided that internally. And what's great about that is it's empowering, because you're working towards building your own skills internally within the organization. And so people internally then are making the change, and of course then that's transformative. And then I've heard this before, and I want to share this too, is that, you know, those being researched or evaluated should have access and opportunity to engage up front in deciding what and how and who, all of that for evaluation. And of course, when you do that, you also gain a lot of buy-in because it supports where everyone is engaged in the process, like data collection. Then we have buy-in because they help make those decisions.
I'm going to butt in again and ask you, what are some of the methods you've used to build your capacity at Dakota Wishohan?
Mm-hmm. So this, of course, didn't happen overnight, but we were really fortunate because a few years ago we had a university researcher, Dr. Heather Peters from the University of Minnesota Morris, come in, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. But she was just really open and willing for us to kind of take over. And we did. We took over the agenda and everything, and I'll share more about that. But what was great is she mentored us, so that piece about, you know, really developing our own capacity and fostering that empowerment was really important. But our growing capacity really emerged from her willingness to do that. We also received an evaluative capacity building grant from the Nota Begay Foundation, but I'm sure there's many others that would support something like that. But that helped us to develop our own evaluation system, and we just completed that not too long ago, and I'll share a little bit more about that. So again, this is Dakota Wishohan's evaluation story, our evaluation story. So again, originally we were approached by Dr. Peters from Morris to do a research project, and in particular she was looking at reducing diabetes rates in American Indian youth through implementing traditional physical activities, like, because she had heard we did a horse program. So, you know, oftentimes in our Indian communities, we've had this negative experience with researchers or research or universities. It's often been that the researcher or the university, their agenda is priority, and then they are the beneficiaries of that project. But we really flipped her project upside down, and we did it to fit our own needs, our own values, and our desired outcomes. So we, of course, knew that horse riding affects more than just a health number or physical health. It's more complex, dynamic, bigger than that. We ended up with a project that actually evaluated the effectiveness of our youth and family programming overall. We decided what measurements to look at, you know, so we weren't really interested in just, you know, collecting a physical number. We did more than that, and then we aligned it with what we were trying to achieve. So we ended up using part of this project, we ended up using some existing instruments, and there's, of course, a lot of them out there, but we chose ones that really fit with what we were trying to evaluate. So, for example, we used a historical losses scale and associated symptoms. We used a psychological sense of belonging instrument, but we also developed our own scales. So one of them we called Wo Dakota Value Scale. We developed a Dakota Identity Instrument, an Indigenous Healing Strategy Scale, and We Chose Ani Scale. And our We Chose Ani Scale is looks at overall health and wellness, but really defined, you know, by our own cultural knowledge, and of course even using our own language. So these were actually more in alignment with our desired outcomes and focus at the time, and we actually continue to use these and a few more. But what's important is this helps tell our story, not just whether or not we have diabetes. And of course, diabetes and physical health measurements are important, and they do have their place. We also recognize that sometimes that overemphasis permeates a negative story, a negative identity for American Indian people. And so I always think about if all young people, if they only hear about diabetes, suicide, alcohol, and drug use, what kind of message does that send? And so one example, and even developing our own scale using this model, health and wellness, that was, again, one of the ultimate goals or outcomes we're desiring from our programming. But again, health has been typically defined and measured outside of ourselves, and those measurements are often negative, and they also don't really recognize the interrelationship between concepts. So in particular, this Wichozani looks at mental health, physical health, and spiritual health, and that they're all interrelated and they're interdependent. So again, we came up with our own scale, and it's pretty simple. It's a 9-item scale, but it's a self-assessment, which again, for us, is more in alignment with our indigenous ways of knowing. So again, after we did that study a few years ago, and we had some positive results regarding our program, and I just want to share just a few nuggets just to, again, kind of get to that. Why do we even do this? Why do we even look at, you know, evaluating something other than just the standard quo? So for example, I'll just share, this was, again, a big study, so I'm not including all of the findings, but so overall, the more people thought about historical losses, the more symptoms they experienced. So of course, that's understandable. But as the individual's Dakota sense of belonging increased, the lower the symptoms they experienced when thinking about historical trauma. So that was really a great finding. And then even to continue that, so when individuals who spoke Dakota more frequently, they also had a higher sense of belonging to Dakota culture. Individuals who speak Dakota more frequently think about historical losses more often. However, they do not experience any more symptoms when they're thinking about these losses. So, wow, what a great finding, you know, especially if we're looking at any health programming or language pieces. So that was a really great finding. And of course, then it demonstrates that language, in fact, is a protective measure. So we also learned some interesting results that informed us that we needed to look at our programming differently for boys. We looked at you know, gender differences. So there was a connection for women between their Wichozani, and again, that's the health and well-being, and indigenous healing strategies. So the way that we were doing our work, there was a correlation there for women. And there was a lesser extent, this connection was also there for girls, but this relationship did not even exist for men and boys. So this in turn caused us to think differently about what we offer as far as programming for our boys. So I think, you know, the success of this research project really created some interest in conducting our own evaluation to really keep moving forward with that. So we saw it as a way to access information that was in alignment with what we wanted. We also knew that the information was of really great value for seeking additional partnerships and funding sources. So this was our initial step towards best practices. In our communities, we often do things because, we innately know that it'll work, and of course, sometimes we even do things without thinking as well. But what's really great about developing your own research and evaluative agenda is that you can find out if what you're actually doing is really working. So thinking about instruments, and again, I shared that we've done both where we used existing instruments and then of course created our own. But the most important is that you're making that selection in alignment with your programming. So there's some instruments, like I said, that we continue to evaluate or measure the success of our work, but we select those that align with what we want. It also helps to further our case of using our own models of evaluation and research. So for example, we found several correlations that aligned with current literature, but using our own terminology and scales like we chose ONI. So for me, I think this process really recognizes the inherent self-determination of Indigenous peoples. I think it's a very good thing. So of course, we're on a learning curve, and so I wanted to share a little bit about some of the challenges and recommendations as folks move forward with their own, looking at their own evaluation process. So of course, back to our story, so since then we began developing our own capacity within our organization through, again, the support of Dr. Peters, and we actually collaborated with the University of Minnesota Morris again on another research project, and of course then we increased our own capacity in that project. But this project was funded under the Collaborative Research Center for American Indian Health. This project was supporting the evaluation of a Dakota curriculum that we developed and that was piloted within a local school district that had a high Native population. So this study was really important to us because it furthered developing our curriculum and our teacher training, and so that we're able to work on moving that to a statewide level. So because of all this work, and we're working on getting out publications, but we definitely began sharing these results with our partners. So like I mentioned, the MB3 Foundation supported us with a capacity building grant. And what we set out to do and did was that we streamlined our evaluation process. So thus far, instead of doing things in piecemeal like by project, we really wanted to streamline that. So we looked at first, again, looking at implementing our own internal evaluation process, and this is our first year doing that. So what we did is we identified about 10 different scales that we've used to gather data and information from our youth and families on a biannual basis. And we're also active in negotiating with our funders how we evaluate our program. So, for example, we had a recent Minnesota Department of Health grant that addresses suicide prevention. So we said, we're going to utilize our We Chose ONI scale as a measurement for health and well-being instead of looking at suicide ideation. So I want to outline a little bit of our process and what we did to streamline this work. So it took about 3 months to work on, again, this is our first year implementing it, but it took about 3 months just to get through the process. And we used basically a backwards design process. We met with all of our staff and leadership at Dakota Wichoka, and we facilitated a broad discussion of each of the program areas. We asked things like, what is it that we're actually trying to achieve? And we went through all of our programs and did that, collected all the information. And then we also asked, what did you like about those research projects we've done? What about the collecting data and the evaluations and the surveys? And then what didn't you like? And we used that to inform our process as well. And then we also asked them to provide information from our youth and families. What is it that what did the kids didn't like? What did they not like about the surveys? And we used all of that information to inform us. We summarized it into part of that program outcomes measured. and we provided all the scales and instruments we've ever used over time, and we asked for feedback on those as well. So we ended up changing some of the wording to kind of reflect our own culture, and then we even changed like the order of questions. And then we matched all of those instruments with outcomes and asked for feedback. Then after that, we drafted a schedule. How often should these be collected? And we ended up primarily utilizing a biannual collection basis. And then we put all that together, all of those results and that feedback, and we developed a comprehensive evaluative framework and a process. And of course, again, we went back and asked for feedback on this. And this feedback is really important because, you know, we're not having someone externally coming in and collecting data. It's all the staff on the ground that are doing that. So it's really important. That's that buy-in, and so it has to be a process that they're really open to doing and wanting to do.
Theresa, you mentioned specifically how to work with youth. How would you vary this to work with other groups in the community?
Well, you know, first I really think that this work has to be done in steps. You know, what I've kind of covered, you know, was something that over a couple of years we've evolved to this place where we're at now. But overall, working with other groups in the community could be a similar process. Whoever your participants are, they should have some input into defining this process. You know, we're learning ourselves. We're on a learning curve. We're in our first year, and we'll revisit and find out, okay, how did that go? What do we need to change? What process do we need to change here? Like, for example, we already know, just kicking this off, we need to be a little bit better about reporting our results to the youth. They want to know more about, well, what did you find out? So, but overall, as far as reporting, we've held some community gatherings and meetings on project results, and then most recently we began sharing our results in our newsletter. It's called the Tiwahe newsletter, our family newsletter. So speaking of Tiwahe, I wanted to share one of our self-designed assessments, the Tiwahe language assessment. And so I think Rondell's going to provide that for you, and you can use it or tweak it or use it for some ideas. But so overall, the Tiwahe language assessment is something we developed kind of over time, but it was to assess our language programming within our families. So actually, a couple of years ago, ANA funded Dakota Wichoka with a grant to help us prepare language teachers through a master apprentice model. We actually had the elders at that time evaluating the language fluency levels of the learners, and that was really difficult for both parties. It was uncomfortable. We also kind of fumbled around with the ACTFL, if people are familiar with that. That language assessment, and just overall, all of that really created where learners were so nervous. It was like test anxiety for them, and their language skills really didn't come through. And then, of course, the elders really wanted to focus on the positive and not be critical. So that kind of was the beginning of us really looking at more having this like self-assessment. So we've had several versions and efforts in between, but this past year we finalized the use of this Tiwahe language assessment. And there are 3 parts to it. So what we're interested in is, of course, the skill level, but also what is the interest? And that's kind of like serves as a little bit of an antecedent for your survey. But we also, it's important for us, considering where we're at with our languages, is it being used at home and how much and frequency? So there's a lot of questions around that. And then we also wanted to really start gauging how is it being used in the community and how frequent, and what those contexts look like. So these three areas really help us focus on what it is we're trying to achieve at this time on the continuum of language fluency in our community. So it asks, why is language important? How well do you speak? Your frequency, your interests, would you like to? Again, that's our antecedent. We also recognize different components, including speaking, reading, and writing, and understanding. We know that understanding is one of the first things you do when you're engaged in language learning. We also address some stereotypes and challenges of language learning. We ask some statements about that to the degree of how much they feel in regarding that statement. We ask them to assess their family language. So part of why we did that is looking at, for our community, we know that oftentimes the mother, or in some cases like the grandmother, is the primary language policy person. They're the ones who really set the tone for language use, or if it's even going to occur in the home. So we have that primary person fill the survey out. And then we look at, again, the various settings, and we know there are differences with that, so cultural events, families, and then even mainstream environments. So again, we just wanted to provide you with some tools just to get thinking for yourself what you want to do for your evaluation process. But we also wanted to just give you a little bit of some resources that I think are some of my favorite resources for looking at Indigenous evaluation. Some of these books, like this first one is a little bit of a textbook kind of level, but there's some really good nuggets in it. So they really look at if you're using an outside evaluator or kind of developing your own capacity, and then everything in between. So again, like I said, the first book is a little bit heady, but it really because it includes going over the history of research and theory, but it has some really good pieces in it. The second book, the Smith book, Decolonizing Methodologies, that really provides some good examples of Indigenous research methods. And so I've talked about research and evaluation a little bit. They're very similar, so one kind of leads into the other. So so what I like about that book is, of course, research isn't just numbers. And of course, she's really a well-known Indigenous scholar. And I also should point out that I think there's a more recent addition to that than the 1999 one. And then the third book is actually my most favorite book because it aligns so much with Dakota worldview or our paradigm. Research is Ceremony, and it reads really well. So to me, in closing, Indigenous people, I feel like we've always done research. And in our Dakota way, we say, or one of the ways that you can say research is akta o depi, to search for. And so, we've had our star knowledge, our medicines, our foods, and all those things. So I guess what I would leave you with is to ask yourself, find out how do you say research in your language.
Great presentation. Thank you so much, Theresa. We're going to open it up in a little bit for questions. Please keep in mind that what Theresa and Dakota Wichoha have been doing has taken many, many years. And of course, your projects are anywhere from 1 to 3 years, and in a few cases up to 5. But it's important to look at, what you said you were going to, the impact that you were going to have in your community, and the results and benefits you expected to have, and come up with a method for collecting data regarding those things so that you can show what the change was from the beginning of the project to the end of the project. It's really difficult to try to generalize because each of ANA's projects are so very different. But given the depth that Dakota Wachoha has taken to really tailor their programming through the use of evaluation, I think it's a really good example to look at. And because it is so focused on culture and lifeways. Okay, well, I have run out my my diatribe for you today, and I'm not seeing any questions come up on the, oops, I take that back. I spoke too soon, as usual. So our question, and I'll probably butcher your name, so excuse me, Madeline, Veneberg, is saying, in our community, many feel overwhelmed with the amount of surveys completed by various departments and events. Do you have any suggestions to increase buy-in, participation in the development process?
Well, so one of the things I guess I'd ask back is, have you shared any of the past results with participants? And if not, I would start there. And another thing is, I think you know, really investing in a streamlined process so that you're not inundating them throughout the year with surveys. But like for us, again, we chose twice a year. So that might be something, and that takes some coordination, especially at a tribal community level when you have multiple departments. I think trying to do that would be something that would be of value. The other, I think, and something that we're going to be doing here at the Lower Sioux community is engaging folks in focus groups. And I think that's a place where you can, you know, talk about some of those things about surveys, and even asking them, what did you like and what don't you like? And I think the big thing is, you know, people want to, you know, want to feel like they're involved in that process and they want to be heard. So I think those are some places to start if you haven't done that already.
Super. Thanks, Theresa. All right, let me take a real quick look. I think that we have answered all the questions. I do want to remind you that there are 2 webinars upcoming in November. One is November 8th, and it is regarding youth, and it is being sponsored by the Western region. And there is another one on the 19th of November, and they'll be looking at technology tools for ANA, and it is sponsored by the Alaska Region Training and Technical Assistance Center. So we hope that you have time to join us. Thank you very much for joining us. Oh, there we go. Theresa's contact information is here on the screen, along with my contact information. So if you come up with any questions or have any comments, please feel free to give us a jingle. So thank you all. Have a good afternoon or a good morning. Take care.